Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to have you with us today for another in our ongoing series of live briefings. My name is Alexander von Rosenbach, and I am the business manager at the International Center for Counterterrorism. I'm very happy to welcome you today to this live briefing on the evolutions of counterterrorism since 9/11, which is based on the book of the same name written by Dr. Thomas Renard, who is Icct's new director. Firstly, just a few notes from my side, and to begin, a note of apology and thanks to all those who were at the last minute switched from a physical event to online. As you see from this opening slide, we had intended to do this as a hybrid event with some folks in the room with us in The Hague and others online. But unfortunately, due to the worsening COVID situation here in the Netherlands, we've had a last minute switch. So thanks for all those who followed us into the online world yet again. And just a note that we do hope one day in the not too distant future to welcome you into a physical event when the conditions allow. Now, in a minute, I'll introduce you properly to Dr. Renard and also to our esteemed discussant, Gilles de Kerkhove, who is the former EU counterterrorism coordinator. But I did want to make a very quick introduction to Icct for those who are less familiar with our work. Icct was, as many of you know, founded on a single conviction, and that is that we believe that long-term security is best achieved through counterterrorism policies and practices that are centered on human rights and the rule of law. We translate that simple conviction into what we think is a straightforward mission, which is to expand the evidence base through research, to take what we learn and share it through the Icct journal, through these kind of events, and through engagement with the media and other channels, and to translate that into adoption at the global, regional, and ultimately at the local level. And with that, we really try to make sure that what we have built up in our 10, 11-year history now is not only stays with us, but actually makes it into the hands of folks like you on the other end of this webinar who are doing the work, thinking about the challenges that lie ahead in the CT space. If you want to know more about Icct, please go to our website. You can sign up to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, the like. We do a lot of events. We also publish a lot. And yeah, there's quite an interesting set of content there for those who are keen. I also want to make a couple housekeeping notes before we kick off here. Important to know that there will be a short, a 30-minute Q&A session, not so short, after the speakers. And you can, of course, as I think most of you are aware by now, submit questions at any time through the panel using the Q&A tool. That is where we will gather up the questions. And important to know for this event, we would like to unmute microphones to allow participants to actually get the chance to voice their questions directly to the panelists. So we will be in contact on the back end to let you know prior to unmuting your mic and to making sure that you're comfortable with that. But yeah, in the spirit of trying to get a little bit more interaction, that has worked well for us in the past few events. So we're going to continue that here. Importantly, there is a post-event survey, which doesn't sound that exciting, but for Icct, it is very, very useful. We do a lot of these events every year, and the challenge for us is to know whether we've made any impact, whether we've had any resonance with those who are on the other side of our screens. And in the real world, it would be easy to see nodding heads or people taking out their phones and checking their email. But in the virtual space in particular, it really comes down to you spending just 30 seconds with us after you decide to leave this webinar at the end and just give us a very quick piece of feedback about how well you liked it, how much you thought this was going to be able to be considered in the work that you do. So we would really appreciate that, and it will pop up on your screen, so it doesn't take much to just help us out with that. And lastly, if you are unable to stay for the whole thing, it's good to know you may have at the start of this briefing that we do record these and we put them onto our YouTube channel. And so if you would like to listen back or share it with a community that wasn't able to join today, the link will be shared with you after the event concludes. Now, let me hand over the floor to Dr. Thomas Renard, who is, as I said, the director of Icct. Thomas's work focuses mainly on counterterrorism and counter-radicalization in Europe. His recent research has centered on the evolution of counterterrorism policy in liberal democracies since 2001, as well as returning foreign terrorist fighters, radicalization in prison, and terrorism recidivism. In addition to his latest book, Thomas has been widely published in many respected journals and think tanks, including International Affairs, Perspectives on Terrorism, the CTC Sentinel, and others. He has also presented research findings to a wide range of policy communities, including the UN Security Council, UNCTAD, the GCTF, Global Counterterrorism Forum, and the European Parliament. And lastly, he also regularly contributes to international media, including working closely with the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, and others. So we are very pleased at ICC to welcome him. This is a little bit, frankly, his coming out to the world. He's been with us since the 15th of September, but this is really the first public event where we are able to showcase his expertise. And of course, along with him, Gilles de Kerkhoff, who will provide a critical and constructive dialogue with him. And with that, Gilles, I think is well known to many, perhaps to everyone on this call, and is indeed a seminal figure in the field of counterterrorism, having held the role of EU counterterrorism coordinator from 2007 to 2021. Over the course of this long and distinguished career, he has contributed significantly to the shaping of important CT initiatives and policies, using his position to maximum effect and making a tangible, long-lasting difference to EU counterterrorism policy. I think I will leave it there, and without further ado, pass it over to Thomas to kick off today's presentations.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good afternoon to everyone, for those who are based in Europe, and good morning to all of you joining us from the other side of the ocean, or hi, wherever you may be situated on this planet. The danger with having your picture, as it was just on the previous slide, in front of you is always that you're reminded that you once used to have more hair than you currently have, but okay, that's how life goes. So indeed, this is my first event, and I'm doing this as I'm sharing my screen as well, as director of Icct, which I joined mid-September, and I must say that I cannot overstate how glad and proud I am to be now part of that institution, Icct, which I think is really a reference for anyone working on terrorism and counterterrorism, both scholars and policymakers and practitioners. So I am really, really glad to be joining what I have discovered to be a very professional, dynamic institution with excellent staff, also very nice people. So I'm really, again, glad to be here and excited at the perspective of all the things that we can do together. And I look forward to, of course, meeting all of you who are today listening to this event, to be working with you in the future, and potentially to build some things together. So if you're interested in the activities of Icct, please reach out to us, be in touch. I think there's a lot of things that can be done together. Indeed, so this is my my first event at Icct, and also there was a good occasion for this event, which is the launch of my book, which came out last month, on the evolution of counterterrorism since 9/11. And of course, there wasn't a better person to share this panel with than Gilles de Kerkhoff, the indeed former EU counterterrorism coordinator, who's always been a reference point to me, and he's always been extremely reachable. I've had numbers of conversations with Gilles, and I must say that he's been also of quite some help as I was working on this book. And I must also mention that Gilles has the foreword actually in this book. So if there is at least one good reason to buy this book, it's to read the foreword, which is by Gilles. So what I want to discuss with you in the context of this presentation, which sort of reflects part of the argument of the book, is basically 3 points. One is how has our conception and potentially also a perception of counterterrorism evolved over the past 20 years, over the past 2 decades. The second question is, why has counterterrorism evolved the way it has done? So I will try to describe what I see as some of the most important, most fundamental evolutions of counterterrorism, but also trying to explain why is it that counterterrorism has evolved in this manner. So basically addressing the subheading or subtitle of the book, the understanding the paradigm shift in liberal democracies. And finally, I will also try to look a bit ahead, not making any prediction, I wouldn't dare, but rather envisaging some potential scenarios for where counterterrorism could be heading in Western democracies. I think that also can help potentially identifying some things to watch, some things to further develop, and some potential looming risks ahead. So having this structure in mind, let me perhaps start with my presentation. And I am just trying to hide some of the things that are on my screen. All right. The way I think basically we can conceptualize or schematize counterterrorism, traditional counterterrorism prior to 2001. And again, this is all schematic, so apologies for a bit of a simplification here. Things are always a little bit more complicated than that, but one could say that prior to 9/11, in Western democracies at the very least, counterterrorism could be conceptualized through these binary approaches of hard prevention and response. So basically the preventive or the hard preventive side of counterterrorism, essentially a bit of deterrence, of target hardening, and of course the work of intelligence services and criminal police. And then of course, potentially even, and depending from one country to another, this can, the balance between these two pillars could shift more in one direction to the other. But the other main pillar of counterterrorism prior to 9/11 was essentially the respond. That is the criminal justice approach to counterterrorism, essentially the work of the criminal judiciary police, magistrates, investigation, prosecution, and that was more or less, in a nutshell, counterterrorism. What has happened essentially over the past 20 years is a number of evolution. And the first one, starting immediately after 9/11, essentially, is a hardening, basically, of these central pillar of the counter or the core of the counterterrorism approach. So basically, we have strengthened or hardened the prevention counterterrorism pillar and also the response pillar. That means essentially, in concretely, that more resources in terms of staff, in terms of money were allocated to intelligence services, to the police, to the services that were directly dealing with terrorism and the prevention of terrorism. Some magistrates have been specializing on counterterrorism. More magistrates have actually been put on these matters. Of course, a number of laws were passed, adopted across Europe. A minority of European countries had specific terrorist offense prior to 9/11, and that changed in the aftermath of 9/11, not least because there was a directive of the European Union that basically created that, that new offense. So that is essentially what I call in my book the hardening of the core of counterterrorism. But there's of course more than that that has happened over the past 20 years, and a significant development has been what I call not the hardening, but the softening of counterterrorism, with the development of softer, non-coercive approach to counterterrorism, more upstream to where hard prevention would essentially begin, and that is what has then been later on conceptualized under the concept of PVE or CVE, what usually now is increasingly referred as PCV, which is a softer, non-coercive approach to prevention, which is often the work of either local police, this approach of community policing, but also the work of frontline practitioners, social workers, street workers, school educators, etc., etc. So there's a whole aspect of prevention that has been developed more upstream to the traditional hard prevention, and there's also a whole pillar that was developed more downstream to the traditional end of coercive counterterrorism with the rehabilitation programs, again also under PCV, because I do believe that from primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention basically span from upstream to downstream, and that essentially includes the work that is being done in prison with violent extremist prisoners. That basically means all the work that is being done in terms of prison regime, sorry, but also in terms of rehabilitation programs in prison, the whole probation system that was developed to deal with the released violent extremist offenders, and also the longer term monitoring of released offenders. So essentially, what we have seen over the past 20 years again is the broadening of the counterterrorism spectrum, with much more work being done upstream in terms of prevention, and we have expanded what we mean and what we understand by the prevention of terrorism, but also with the broadening of the response spectrum of counterterrorism, which basically means that counterterrorism and counter-extremism policies do not stop with the prosecution and individuals being sent to prison, but it does continue much longer over time with a longer monitoring of these individuals. And of course, as it has been discussed in a number of papers, studies by many other authors, it is basically also through the conception of counterterrorism, we have come to put under that approach other concerns, other concepts such as extremism, radicalization, which have basically blurred the lines of where counterterrorism where counterterrorism starts and where counterterrorism ends. With counter-extremism or counter-radicalization, there's a lot of blurred lines there. And also for the practitioners and the policymakers dealing directly with these matters, it is not always self-evident, I think, for them. If you speak with them, that's basically what they will tell you, whether they belong to that counterterrorism family or not. And if they, sometimes some people will conceive that they are part of that family, but they would not conceive themselves as part of that counterterrorism family. And that inherently creates a number of tensions for themselves, for the institution, and for the relationship between them and their institution and other more traditional counterterrorism services, but I will come back to that. An additional point that I wanted to make at this stage is that a number of you are most likely familiar with the waves theory, which basically means that counterterrorism, that terrorism comes in wave, and that's the theory of David Rappaport, essentially identifying four main terrorist waves in modern history, from anarchist terrorism all the way to religious terrorism nowadays. The point that I think is also quite relevant to make is that if terrorism evolve in waves, counterterrorism similarly also come in waves, which partly reflect the terrorism waves, but also partly reflect, I think, smaller waves within these broader waves. And basically what you see is, after not every terrorist attack, but in some circumstances, after certain attacks, certain plots, certain particular incidents, you have a whole series of measures, policy decisions, legal decisions that basically expand the remit of terrorism. And a lot of these counterterrorism waves basically have a long-term impact. So not everything that has been decided over the past 20 years basically will stay with us forever. I think a number of services might close shop at some point. The policy focus might shift, and I will come back to that when I discuss the scenarios. A number of laws might fall into oblivion, but a number of these things will stay and potentially will be reactivated in the future. And so I do speak of waves, but I also make the allegory with the life cycle of glaciers in my book. Basically, a glacier basically over the years expand and contract continuously, and basically it is only over a longer period of time that you can tell whether the glacier is advancing or whether it is retreating. And I think basically the same can be true with counterterrorism. And for instance, we do have still a number of measures, or even thinking about terrorism and how to address terrorism, that still comes from how we were responding to anarchist terrorism, for instance, in the late 19th, earlier 20th century. So I think it's quite important to be aware of that phenomenon as well. And very quickly, just to say that when I do mention all of that, it is essentially the evolution of counterterrorism in the domestic context, but it does also bear impact in how we approach counterterrorism in a global context and in the external policies, whether it is intervening abroad or whether it is funding programs or training programs that we do support and implement in other countries. The implications of all of this is quite obvious, I think, to a lot of you, quite straightforward. The hardening of the core of counterterrorism basically means that we do have much more counterterrorism actors and policies, both in hard prevention and in the criminal justice response. We have seen in the early to the mid 2000s the creation, for instance, of counterterrorism fusion centers in the US and CTC, but also across Europe. We have seen new units being created within police services, within intelligence services. We have seen new intelligence services being created in the 2000s, and even also in recent years, for instance, in France, with the penitentiary intelligence service, with a focus on radicalization in prison and the monitoring of violent extremist prisoners. So much more, many more actors, many more policies, which basically requires then, of course, more coordination, interagency cooperation between all of these actors, which is one of the key challenges, of course, of this expansion of the remit of the spectrum of counterterrorism, but also more PCV actors and policies at the extremities of that spectrum. And these PCV actors can, to some extent, be part of the more traditional security structure. So some of them might be part of the falling under the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Justice, Penitentiary Administration. But a lot of these actors also fall completely outside of that traditional spectrum. These are social actors, psychosocial actors, psychologists, mental health actors, CSOs, NGOs, etc., etc. So basically, as I was saying, that requires more counterterrorism policy coordination, more interagency coordination. And I think a lot of you probably are familiar with the fact that multi-agency approach, comprehensive approach have become sort of mantras of the day when it comes to countering terrorism and extremism. And that is and remains a challenge, even though I think a lot of progress has been achieved in that particular aspect. It does remain challenging on a daily basis, and even more so when you try to coordinate, of course, between the CT traditional policies and the PCV policies and actors, where you do have actors coming from completely different world backgrounds, cultures, who have completely different missions and objectives, different security protocols, different ways of working, in terms of also their relationship with their beneficiaries. That does also further complicate the conduct of counterterrorism, and that has been also one of the key aspect or issue around which a lot of work has had to be done over the past 2 decades to improve that coordination, and a lot of mechanisms, some of which are more formal, institutionalized, such as the counterterrorism fusion centers, for instance, that I already mentioned. Some of them are, if not more informal, at least probably less high on the radar, more operational as well. If you think in the US of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but in many other countries, in Belgium, for instance, and my book has a lot, of course, on Belgium. I did speak with a lot of actors there in Belgium, and you do see traces of that, of these informal operational platforms with different actors coming around the table, things that were unimaginable basically 20 years ago. You would never have these actors around the table, and if you managed to put them around the table, they would not even open their mouth. But these things have changed in the context of higher threat, in a new way, in a new perception and conception of counterterrorism has come to be accepted. That has been facilitated, but again, not to say that any of that is simple. This is basically a lot about horizontal or interagency cooperation. Let's not forget that there is also this need for vertical coordination or cooperation, because particularly in the PCV sector, there's a lot of it that occurs at the local level. And so you need to have this coordination between the local level, the regional levels, and the national level, but also, of course, with the international organizations, whether at the European level, whether at the global level. There is much more integration that is needed between all of these levels of policy making, which is also further densifying the field of counterterrorism. So because I've been speaking about the hardening and the softening of counterterrorism, of course, that begs the question, if you make the parallel with Joe and I's smart soft power, hard power, smart power, whether we have evolved towards something that we could call smart or smarter counterterrorism, which is something that I address as well, of course, in my book. And I think here, you do hear arguments in this debate, both in favor and against, or at least critical of that evolution that I have been describing. When it comes to arguments in favor of that particular evolution, some scholars have talked about an evolution that was welcomed, reflecting the plea of many counterterrorism scholars over the since basically the 1960s, 1970s, a number of studies that had been looking at the history of counterterrorism campaigns, traditionally often in Northern Ireland, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in other parts of the world as well. Oftentimes, the conclusion was that the most effective responses to terrorism and terrorism campaigns were comprehensive, multi-pronged response, which again is in line with this evolution that we have witnessed over the past 2 decades. There had also been a long time research, basically putting the emphasis on the root causes of terrorism, or later on the conducive environment to terrorism and radicalization. And again, this evolution is much more in tune with that particular research. And also, of course, the whole argument that with more prevention, with more upstream prevention, also we can prevent people to turn to violent extremism, and therefore we can reduce the amount of individuals of concern, and therefore reduce the pressure on the core of the counterterrorism services. So all of these arguments basically are in favor of this evolution, but at the same time, there's a high number and very important arguments, critical arguments that have been developed, not against, but or partly against, but also at the very least moderating a bit the enthusiasm for this evolution. And in that particular literature, you have scholars who have been denouncing what they see as the evolution towards a pre-crime criminalization, or basically creating a pre-crime space, criminalizing the pre-crime space by basically all of these policies that target radicalization and even criminalize to some extent radicalization. There is a form of a tendency towards a form of thought policing. There is this thing that we all, I think, can see after a major incident, after an attack. There's more measures that are being announced. Some of them are followed, implemented, some of them not. But of course, that inevitably always create this feeling, trigger this feeling that we are always seeking 100% security, a zero risk society that is basically a pretty high target, not to say impossible target. There's a lot of criticism around, of course, the concept of radicalization. What is radicalization? Should we criminalize radicalization? Do we understand enough radicalization to prevent it? And can radicalization be prevented at all? So there's a lot of dimension to that literature, but which is, I think, perhaps one of the most developed in that particular critical approach to counterterrorism. The secretization of social policies. I did describe how social actors are now part of this PCV and that broader counterterrorism family, but that secretization of social policies do raise a lot of questions because it goes against the fundamental objectives and missions of social work. It does create a lot of unease among social workers. It does create difficult relationship between social workers and security services, etc., etc. And the broader accusations is a very hard word, but criticism that some of our societies are evolving towards a form of surveillance society. And all of that, in a way, I do frame that more broadly in my book, in the sort of very traditional inherent dilemma to counterterrorism, I believe, between underreaction and overreaction. So basically, policymakers are always torn between not doing enough in the face of terrorism but also doing too much might also lead to counterproductive effects, and not least because there is this inertia in the system. A lot of these measures that are decided will stay on for a very long time, and potentially will be built up further with the next wave of counterterrorism. So there's always this very fine equilibrium to be found between underreaction and overreaction, which is again a very traditional dilemma to counterterrorism, which was already largely discussed by the founding fathers of terrorism studies, such as Paul Wilkinson and others. Now I see that time is running, so I will try to speed up a bit on this part of my presentation. But the second key question that I do try to address in my book is essentially not only trying to describe this evolution that as I've just done, but also trying to understand why has counterterrorism evolved in this manner. And also, basically, if we are all confronted with a similar threat from terrorism, and if we all Western liberal democracies, why is it that counterterrorism is so different from one country to another? So basically, why are we not conceiving and implementing counterterrorism in the same manner from one country to another? And basically, to understand and to explain that, what I do in my book is I basically turn to public policy theory, and I do study counterterrorism policymaking as basically an ordinary policy, and I rely on that literature from public policy theory. And if you're not familiar with that literature, which I wasn't when I started this project, it's important to understand like two key principles of public policy theory, which is basically bounded rationality and complex policymaking environments. This means basically two things. It means on the one hand that policymakers are not omniscient, so they cannot know everything. They cannot weigh the pros and cons of every single potential policy, measure the potential positive and negative aspects of all of that. So they always have limited resources, limited time, and limited visibility on a problem and the potential solutions. And on top of that, they work in this complex policymaking environment, which means that they're surrounded by a number of actors that try to shape their thinking about these problems, trying to influence them. And that also has, of course, an impact on what they think they should do, but also what they can do in reality. And so that means basically that policies and policy choice is essentially in that particular, if you accept those two founding principles, is influenced by exogenous factors and endogenous factors. Exogenous factors essentially is events. So you do have a number of events that will always shape what you perceive as a problem, a policy problem, and potential solutions. And you do have endogenous factors, ideas, interests, and institutions, essentially, that will also help you shape your thinking, your response to a certain policy problem. Ideas, essentially, are the broader ideologies, ideas, norms, principles that circulate around us. And if you don't look just strictly at counterterrorism, let's just think that you have the traditional left-wing ideas or the right-wing ideas, the liberal ideas, libertarian ideals, etc., that all things that circulate and that basically are broader overarching ideas that influence a lot of the ways that we look at problems. Interest essentially means that you do have a number of stakeholders that are trying to push for their own view of the problem and solutions, which it's itself sometimes embedded or take part in a broader interinstitutional fighting between different institutions that try to promote their own perspective, their own vision of problems. You do have lobby groups, you do have CSOs, you do have NGOs, and of course all the different departments that may also fight one another to promote their own views of the problem and their own solutions. And then you have institutions, which are not institutions in the sense of organizations, but rather basically the policy routines, basically how things are being done. So institutional cultures as well. So basically how one service addresses a problem. And for instance, in the field of counterterrorism, you would have some countries where intelligence services really are in the lead for counterterrorism, whereas in other countries, it rather is the prosecutor's office that will be more in the lead for counterterrorism investigation, or sometimes it's the police that has the upper end. The way information flows between these different services, where the case is passed from one pair of hands to another. All of that basically is built on years, if not decades, of dealing with problems. And so that is built in the system, and that is basically what we call institutions in public policy theory. And so to understand how public policies evolve, are shaped, then you need to basically take all of that into account. So if you want to study the evolution of counterterrorism policy making, and if you want to understand why counterterrorism policies have evolved in a certain way in one country as opposed to other ways, and if you want to understand this paradigm shift that I see with this broadening of the counterterrorism spectrum, you need to put all of these factors into the equation. And basically the way to do this is to recognize that you do have a number of events that may have a particular importance, resonance within the policymaking world. So, and in the field of terrorism or counterterrorism, of course, attacks or major plots can play that role. Not every terrorist attack, not every terrorist plot will trigger a major change of policy, but some of them will. That was the case of 9/11, that was the case of Madrid and London bombing, and that was also the case of, I argue in my book, Made in Amouche attack against the Jewish Museum in May 2014. So you do need these focusing events, which basically will allow certain ideas to emerge, or they will allow certain interest groups to push forward to their own interest, to their own preferences, and also to change some of the institutions in the system. So basically, these focusing events create a window of opportunity for a rebalancing between ideas, institutions, and interests, which can eventually then lead to a paradigm shift in public policy. And that is basically what I describe essentially in my book, how this has happened generally, but also more specifically in the context of Belgium, with this arrow there of path dependency, which is quite important to recognize that in many countries, even though counterterrorism has evolved more or less in a similar direction with this broadening of the counterterrorism spectrum, there's a number of differences which are partly explained by this phenomenon of path dependency, which is basically that institutions, countries do not always reinvent the wheel. So sometimes when they identify a new policy need, they will look into their portfolio. They will look at the different tools, institutions that they already have, and they will see whether they can basically relaunch, reboost some of these platforms, for instance, that were a little bit dormant, whether they can improve them, instead of again creating something new from scratch. Sometimes they will look to their neighbors. Sometimes they will look at what they were doing, how they were confronting with a similar challenge, but in another field. So for instance, the prevention of radicalization took a lot of inspiration from the public health sector, and also with the prevention of drugs, trafficking and addiction. So you do have this this path dependency within countries, but also across countries. And I'm fully aware that I have to go a bit fast on this, so I may not have time to go as deeply as I would like to explain all of these ideas, but please please feel free to get back to me, and we can go back to this conversation in the Q&A. And finally, and very briefly then, looking ahead, I do identify in my book 3 broad scenarios. They're not realistic scenarios, they're just sort of, you would call them ideal type kind of scenarios of where counterterrorism might evolve in the coming years. The first scenario, I call that, and that's of course a term that was coined more than 10 years ago by Gilles de Kerchove, so he will like it, but I call that counterterrorism fatigue. That is a scenario under which basically, even though terrorism and radicalization remain a concern for policymakers, there's so many other issues that keep rising on the agenda with great powers competition, cybersecurity, organized crime, trafficking, etc., that basically the resources available for counterterrorism decline. Some of it is shifted to these new issues. We're losing the expertise. Some people who basically were the pioneers of PCV, for instance, move on with their life, they go to other jobs. So we lose the resources, we lose the expertise, and basically you see a progressive disinterest basically for counterterrorism that may then be problematic if we are confronted with more extremism in the future, other forms of extremism, but also potentially a new wave of mobilization for another conflict, more attacks, etc., etc. A second scenario, I call it consolidation. Basically, it is to say that policymakers come to the conclusion that we have reached a satisfying point, and basically it is true that there's a lot of pressure on the resources. There is a risk that expertise might move on, go away. So it is important to try to consolidate that, also because we already see the emergence of new threats related to extremism and violent extremism, whether on the far left, whether on the far right, whether with regard to conspiracy theories, etc., etc. And so therefore, the priority is rather to try to take stock of what we have achieved and try to see how we can use what already exists to make sure that it is sustainable, that it will stay there for the longer term, but also that it is adjustable to deal with these other threats linked to extremism and violent extremism. And the third scenario is the one of further expansion. So it is to say we have already quite significantly expanded the spectrum of counterterrorism over the past 20 years, but there might be other incidents. Let's imagine there's a European Christchurch, or let's imagine that there is a significant attack by an Islamist terrorist released from prison, and that lead basically to yet another round of expansion of the counterterrorism arsenal, further hardening, but also potentially a hardening of the softening side, to the extent that basically we continue expanding on that counterterrorism spectrum, which is of course the one scenario that raises the more concern about fundamental freedoms, liberties, and the risk of counterproductive effects, of course. I will stop here because I have taken more than the time that was given to me, and I apologize for this. So there is the link to the book, and it's already available from Routledge, but also from Amazon and other platforms. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to listen to your questions after the presentation of Gilles. Thank you very much.
Gilles, I think the floor is yours. You're welcome to unmute and just jump right in there and respond.
Can you hear me? Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Thomas, for your very kind words. Let me first start by congratulating Thomas first for his appointment as director of the Icct, which is a very good think tank. And I remember I was at the inaugural meeting of the Icct, I don't know, many years ago. And I remember that most of my speech was focused on the substance, the legal approach to the fight against terrorism, because at the time, we in Europe had issues with the US policy of the global war on terror. And that's something which evolved very, very much. Congratulations to Thomas again for his excellent book, as he said, available not only on Amazon, I think you can go around. And it's a very interesting read. I was fortunate and happy to be in the jury who looked at this dissertation, and I'm very happy that it became a book because it's not only an interesting read, it's full of information. Even myself, being Belgian and knowing a bit what Belgium is doing, I learned a lot. And it tried to go through an interesting approach using as he said, the theoretical approach of the public policy literature, and that leads to interesting finding. The most obvious one is what he said himself, that we have to consider CT at this stage as an ordinary policy, and we can learn a lot from that. I won't be too long, just three quick issues around my forward in the book. The first one, to say something about the evolution of the role of the European Union, because that's what I've been doing for the last 14 years. Then it will be, due to the time, more telegraphic than in detail, but that may prompt question in the Q&A. 7 challenges as I see looking ahead. And finally, maybe react to some of the statements made by Thomas on CT fatigue, on securitization, and the like. The first on the evolution of the role of the EU. Counter-terrorism has always been what I call in French le fil rouge, the common thread of the integration in the field of internal security. And if indeed, rightly so, Thomas is right, events, it was a lot prompted by events. It occurred like waves, and every major attack led to a major step in the integration process. We all remember it started with what is called the Trevi Cooperation, with a big terrorist attack in Munich against the Israeli sportsmen. Then we had Giscard d'Estaing launching the European judicial space after the hijacking of an Air France plane, which landed in Entebbe. And then 9/11 led to the European arrest warrant, the creation of Eurojust, and I won't go through the history. And I've always said, because I was most of the time in the last 26 years, the one who was holding the pen, that you have to be prepared to put again on the table your unsold goods, because it's an issue of sovereignty, and integration is a painful process. And yes, events help mobilizing the common will to make a step towards more integration. Institutionally, the major step did occur with the Treaty of Lisbon and the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. It changed completely the institutional context, but even that did not change completely the mindset of our heads of state and government and the Commission as well. I remember that in 2009, a French commissioner, and it's no secret, Jacques Barrot, stopped the initiative of the DG Home and a Maltese guy who spent 1 year drafting a communication on PREVENT because he thought it was not for the Commission to come with something on PREVENT. And so the mindset at the time of the Commission was, we, the EU, are there modestly to support member states, which are the main responsible for internal security. And indeed, after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, the balance between member states and EU was 90% member states, 10% European Union. On top of it, at the request of the Brits, in the last phase of the negotiation, a small sentence has been added to the treaty, according to which member states are the solely responsible for national security, not internal security, but national security, which means the field of intelligence. And most of our member states consider that the EU has no competence in the field of intelligence, which I dispute in a way, but politically, there is no wish to develop intelligence cooperation inside the EU framework. But the real change, and I really experienced that myself, did happen with the attack against Charlie Hebdo. And it has been amplified by the attack in Paris, Bataclan, and then Brussels. It changed completely I would say, the feeling in Brussels, the mindset, and the appetite of our member states, of our heads of state and government for using the European Union as the place where to develop counterterrorism policy. The heads of state and government in January 2015 really set the scene, gave guidance to the system, and asked all of us to do more in the field of repression, prevention, and engaging a lot more with third state, and especially our direct neighborhood from Morocco to Turkey, including the Western Balkans. The Commission has produced excellent papers, the EU Security Union Strategy, which has been updated in June 2020, recently with a CT agenda. And when you read this, you will see that I can state that the European Union is a genuine security provider. And what is more interesting even is to see that member states after 2015 have decided to involve systematically all agencies, and especially Europol and Eurojust, in all CT investigation and prosecution, which they were not doing before. And that's a key change. And we've seen as well Frontex a lot more involved in counterterrorism as well, which Frontex was not doing before. So yes, all this has been, to a certain extent, to a large extent, prompted by events. Let me go then through some challenges, and I've identified 7. There are many more, but that's the one which I still have in my mind while leaving my position. The first is access to data. No time to develop that, but there are 2 elements which explain why it's so a sensitive issue. The first, it's the consequence of the Snowden leaks, which has led the big internet companies to develop a very sophisticated encryption system on their platform. And the second one is, of course, the GDPR policy of the European Union, which has the consequence that it's a lot more difficult than before to collect data than we were doing before. And the second one is the US leadership in the digital world. And all this has led both the Court of Justice to develop a lot more demanding case law in terms of collection of data and sharing of data, and our Parliament, especially the Libe Committee of the European Parliament, to be more and more reluctant towards any initiative by the Commission and the Council to develop new data collection legislation or agreement like PNR, TFTP, getting access to digital evidence, and so on. There are solutions, no time to develop them, but I'm very convinced of the need to have an EU legislation in the field of access to metadata, despite the case law of the court, based on the case law of the Court of Justice, as well as the legislation. It's a lot more sensitive on encryption, and I hope that the Commission will come with proposal in the coming months. There are a lot of other approaches which I think I don't have time to develop, but changing the approach, using a lot more what is called regulatory sandboxes, like we do for artificial intelligence, develop a lot more privacy by design, harness more new technologies like pseudonymization, anonymization, what is called differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, and so on. And there are other needs, like the need for security service to come a lot more regularly to Brussels to brief the European Parliament, especially the Libe Committee, which they only have done once when the Parliament had set up an investigative committee to understand what went wrong in the attack in Bataclan and Brussels. But that has to happen a lot more, like it does happen in our member states. And finally, another idea which I failed to launch when I was in my previous position was to create some sort of forum where the top CEO of the big technological companies, members of the Court of Justice, and top policymakers would discreetly talk to each other and inform each other of the respective development. I can develop that later if you want. The second one is prevent, which Thomas has developed quite in detail. We have to accept that here we've made significant progress. Thomas and I, we were at the 10th anniversary of the Radicalization Aware Network some 1 or 2 weeks ago. It's amazing what they have developed over these 10 years. The range of issues which are discussed, the quality of the advice and the papers they have produced, and the number of people which have been involved. I think it's more than 6,000 members of the Radicalization Aware Network working together. This is pretty impressive. Where we need more in terms of prevent, I think be a lot better in spotting the looming new forms of extremism. Our member states, most of them fail to detect early enough the FTF, foreign terrorist fighters phenomenon. And I suppose we will see a lot more new forms of extremism, even which some of them have already expressed themselves during the COVID and the confinement. One that I myself often mention, maybe wrongly so, is what I call technophobia. We've seen during confinement 5G masts being set on fire. The office of a telecom company has been destroyed in Paris. And some people could react violently in tomorrow's society where all objects will be connected, with robots and chatbots will replace human beings more and more, where CCTV, facial recognition, AI will monitor us all, and 5G will push internet more and more into our lives. And so this is very important that it is detected early enough. On substance, I think the policy should do more in different directions. First, boost a lot more what I call the CV relevant policies. The criticism that Thomas referred to of securitization of prevent is important. And I think we have started doing that, but we should do a lot more by mobilizing other policies like education, culture, youth, sport, and do that more not just because of prevent concern, but they play a major role, and I think there is the potential for doing a lot more. Doing more in disengagement and rehabilitation. Again, no time to develop that, but it's so relevant for the FTF returnees, for prison leavers, for lone actors radicalized in our society. A third, address a lot more energetically the ideological driver of radicalization. I've started that 2-3 years ago by engaging with the Gulf state and especially with Saudi Arabia. I know too well how much sensitive this issue is, but it's clearly something where we need to do a lot more. And it applies not only for jihadist terrorism, but also for right-wing violent extremism. And finally, internet, where we have done an excellent work, I think, with different steps, but where there are still a lot to do. We are currently, the Parliament and the Council currently discussing draft legislation, the DCA, where I would like to see improvement, and especially on the issue of algorithm amplification, which plays a major role in the process of radicalization, where I believe we need an EU agency to audit the algorithm. The recent leaks and the whistleblower that confirm my fear that both YouTube, Facebook are designing their algorithm with a view to keeping the users as much as possible on the platform, call for that. So that's on prevent. The third one, no time again, but I think it's something which will become more and more important, is the way we address the consequence of the emergence of disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing, 3D printing, weaponization of space, synthetic bio, and the like. This will create new threats. This will provide new opportunities, and this will have a major impact, transformative impact on the way we will provide justice and security in the future. And to be honest, the internal security community is a bit lagging behind in this field. And that has led all of us to push for the creation of an innovation hub at Europol, but among all the EU agencies dealing with justice and home affairs. And it's only the start of a process where we need to, and I maybe do that, it's not the wrong way to put it, but we need to create a place where a sort of a small lobby, in the positive terms, can mobilize member states' expertise and get access to more financing program and more impact in the policy discussion in Brussels. For impact of COVID, I looked recently at a paper that I produced during the confinement to look at the risks of COVID. And interestingly, some of the fear I had expressed have not materialized. Some other have materialized. What has not materialized is an increase in the number of terrorist attacks in the European Union as a direct consequence of the pandemic. We've had some new attack in October and November last year, with the beheading of Paty, with the attack in Nice and in Vienna. But here, I would say COVID dimension is not the right one. It's more the religious dimension. We've not seen no attack on medical personnel or facilities, no weaponization of the virus. It may happen one day, but it has not been the case. We have not seen a huge spread of the virus in northeast Syria, which was one of my fears, with a lot of riots, prison outbreak, nor any policy shift in the European Union towards other priorities. I think for the time being, there is not a city fatigue. The beheading of Paty and the crisis in Afghanistan, of course, kept CT high on the agenda. But what has materialized is a boost of extremist content on internet, with the convergence of different type of speech, terrorist speech, hate speech, and disinformation. The emergence of new forms of extremism, I mentioned that before. And but that's not cyber terrorism for the time being, but a boom and a huge increase in cybercrime. 5, just to mention it, what I call the legacy of the Caliphate. It remains a big challenge for all of us. Women, children, and men are still detained in northeast Syria by the Kurds. Our member states have started some sort of repatriation. And the EU in Brussels has tried to mobilize all the financing program possible in order to avoid that the situation gets worse, waiting for the right moment for either repatriation, which is one option, or that these people be tried in the region, which is something that some of our member states are still exploring. 6, Afghanistan. I think I will just let it like this and not enter into the detail. It's not a current threat, but it's potentially entailing several risks in terms of infiltration into migration flow, in terms of letting AQ develop itself and re-energize its network over the years, in terms of boosting the jihadist morale all over the world, and especially in terms of terrorist financing, because we know how much organized crime has developed in Afghanistan in many respects. And finally, again, no time to discuss this challenge, based on the rise of terrorism in Africa. Let me just then turn to the last point, some conclusion. If we do we have city fatigue? As I've just said, I've not experienced that myself, except maybe around 2010, 2011. Unfortunately, because there has been a series of attacks, which, as I've said, has always crystallizing the political will. But that's something that may happen. That's a risk. And it's probably for that reason that a position like the one I've been in charge of for 14 years has been creating, having someone who tried to keep the topic high on the agenda. Then it leads to another question: have we been focusing too much on city to the detriment of other issues like organized crime, like cyber crime? In a way, yes. It is. It has always been a bit of surprise to me to see that the political leadership is a lot more focused on counterterrorism than other forms of threat for our democracy, and organized crime is a major threat. If you look at the scale, the size of organized crime in our society and the potential negative impact on democracy, I think it's equally worrying. But in a way, at least in the integration process, every step that you undertake by reinforcing the agencies, by providing these agencies with new tools and methods, by mobilizing financing program, I think is in a way dual use. You can most of the time use it for organized crime as well. 3, have we been overreacting? Have we been building a surveillance society? I don't believe so. Frankly, it's a bit short to state that so bluntly. First, because after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, we now have the European Parliament involved in co-decision. And when you look at the procedure to get one legislation adopted, it starts with impact assessment prepared by the Commission. It lasts for some time, 2 years before something comes to the table of the Council. And then you have a very cumbersome and very lengthy process between the Council and the European Parliament. And to be honest, the Libe Committee in the European Parliament is a lot more freedom-oriented than security-oriented. So I fail to see that. What I regret in a way is that we have never used a sunset clause in our legislation, which the Americans are doing, which force the government to come to the Parliament from time to time to seek the prolongation of a legislation which creates derogatory powers or more intrusive mechanisms. 4, are we over-securitizing prevent, CVE or PVE? Again, I don't believe so. And I mentioned the radicalization aware network. For many years, most of the policy that we have followed were inspired by this network and by the work of field practitioners, by social workers, by psychologists, by teachers, by prison staff, by people who are doing the job, and we're reflecting on the best practices, what works, what does not work. But again, we have to be cautious not to mix up. And when I said we need to do a lot more CV relevant policy, we should avoid to steer them or mobilize them only for with security logic and dynamics. And finally, has the EU, the European Union, played a role in the policy of the member states, or is it the opposite, that the EU has only been the place where member states were trying to export their own policy in CT? I think the European Union has played a significant role in, not in all member states. Some are more security-minded or oriented than others, but has played a concrete role. Thomas referred to fusion centers. That's something which started with the US. That was the main finding of the 9/11 report, connecting the dots. It was then developed by some of the member states and extended to all the member states, thanks to the European Union, thanks to a peer evaluation process that we launched at the time. In terms of legislation, I think when the EU adopted the CT legislation, only 6 or 7 member states had a counter-terrorism legislation, and therefore had not incriminated as such the participation in a terrorist organization and then later traveling abroad for training purposes and so on. And prevent, if I only take that policy, I remember large member states having not a single prevent policy when the European Union adopted its legislation. So, and the best example is, of course, internet. So these are some reaction to the excellent book and presentation by Thomas. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you very much, Gilles and Thomas again. I wanted to just acknowledge that we have run over on the presentation, so I am going to try to let some time allot past 17:30 here in the Netherlands for questions. So hopefully folks can stick with us here. Maybe we'll just jump right into it. The first question that we got, the brave first folk with their hands up, was Ani Kashadurian, and I'm happy for her to get unmuted and ask her question directly.
Thank you, appreciate it. Fascinating talk. So I'm a grad student at the FU Amsterdam in the Law and Politics of International Security program. And this talk overall got me thinking. I'm wondering if you think that trauma-based approaches towards counterterrorism efforts, for example, in terms of repatriation of former fighters, would this be something that gains more and more serious consideration as a part of public policy?
Yeah, I mean, I can address that very quickly. So thank you very much for your question, Ani. It's a great question, and the short answer would be yes. There is increasing space and attention to that. I mean, clearly, I can tell you that Icct, as being part of the RAN, of the Radicalization Awareness Network, we do receive sort of policy concerns, policy priorities directly from the member states through that particular channel, and a lot of requests with regard to trauma-informed management of foreign fighters, returnees, both for adults but also for children. So there is this awareness that we could potentially learn from other fields, they call sometimes adjacent fields, but also that we can be a little bit more innovative in our rehabilitation management. It's sort of moving beyond the traditional de-radicalization versus disengagement discussion that I think has sort of crystallized a lot of the discussions over the past few years, but hasn't been really productive in terms of improving our management of violent offenders and returning foreign fighters. So again, the short answer is yes, there is a lot of interest and scope for that kind of approach.
Gilles, did you want to respond from your perspective?
When I was in charge, the member states were not ready to have a specific role of the European Union on the subject of repatriation as such. And this is the reason why I mobilize the European Union on another aspect, which is waiting for a decision by the member states to repatriate. And some are doing that more and more. We have seen recently more and more, I think the Swedes have most recently taken additional action to improve the conditions in both the camp where women and children are detained and the prison, like Asake and other places where the people captured after the fall of Baghouz are detained, because the conditions of the detention conditions are pretty tough. And we have worked very closely with the ICRC. We are supporting several NGOs to, as I said, avoid that the situation gets worse. The decision to repatriate is not an easy one. It's obvious. First, in some of the member states, there is no public support at all for repatriation. Second, the position that it's better to have these people tried in the region or the country where they have committed their crime can make sense, provided that you find an adequate place to try these people. And finally, the number. It's of course something different when you have to repatriate 3 or 4 FTF, like the United States, or when, like France, you have to repatriate hundreds. If I remember well, because I have been myself extremely active on the issue of Gitmo, trying to convince our member states to host Gitmo detainees in order to help President Obama to shut and close the Guantanamo detention center and switch the paradigm of the global war on terror. At the time, I remember the Americans have not taken one single Gitmo detainees because it was politically very difficult. So I think it's not black and white. I think the top priority should, of course, be the kids, because they have nothing to do with what did happen. So the more we can talk to the Kurds and try to repatriate these people, the better. For the adults, it's a bit more difficult. But for me, the top priority was to avoid the deterioration of the detention conditions, because I've been there in July. I can tell you, visiting Al-Hol and Asake is quite an experience.
Sure. Thank you, Gilles. I think indeed, yeah, we know well that the conditions in those camps are themselves a trauma, in addition to the experiences that particularly the children have lived through under the Caliphate and the like. So, interesting response. I do want to go right to the next question. It is anonymous, so I don't have anyone to unmute, but it was speaking to the question of whether the notion of hybrid threat thinking, something that has crossed our path in many different conversations over the last few years, this notion of hybrid threats is becoming part of the CT conversation, and whether it can enrich our understanding of counterterrorism if we broaden what we mean and include these hybrid threats as part of our universe.
Yes, I can say something
Please.
on that. Yes, to a certain extent, if you refer to disinformation for a campaign, for instance, during COVID, it was, as I've said, we've seen a boom on internet of different type of content. We were familiar with the classical Daesh type terrorist content. we've seen a huge increase in hate speech, especially on the right-wing violent extremism front. But we have seen as well disinformation by state or non-state actors. When, for instance, the President of France, Macron, delivered a speech au bureau in a place on the issue of separatism in France, when the French government tabled a draft legislation on separatism in the French parliament, there has been a huge disinformation campaign on internet to promote the idea that France was clearly anti-Muslim, Islamophobic, with a lot of fake accounts and so on. Who is behind? I don't know. But in a way, the more you push that idea, the more you may inspire lone actors not connected to Daesh or Al-Qaeda, and as we've seen with Paty, because what was interesting, I thought, in the most recent attack in France and in Vienna, Nice, Paty, and Vienna, it's not that they were promoting a clear Daesh ideology. They were more trying to avenge the prophet. There was a lot more religious dimension in all this. So if you try to promote on internet disinformation that the policy of a state is clearly against a group of people, the Muslim, it may have this impact. So in a way, this is something we have to look at in our discussion with the internet companies and in the draft legislation, which I referred to earlier, like the Digital Service Act.
Thank you very much. I am going to push on then to the next question, again, an anonymous question, and with two different prongs to it. The first is, I guess, this role of what the question is forming as peace ambassadors, and specifically the role of using reformed terrorists or those that have served prison and been rehabilitated as ambassadors for peace. So Icct has done this in the past in Indonesia, so be full disclosure there that we have had some involvement in that ourselves, but I think it is not uncontroversial. And I'm the question is asking, what your views on the panel are of that. And secondly, the notion of how to support family members of terrorists, recognizing that indeed not all family members who have someone who commits a terrorist crime are sympathetic or at all aligned with the views of an individual attacker. How can we engage more with the families of those who are radicalized, perhaps is the better question to help mitigate the threat. So slightly different tacks. I'm happy for Thomas, I see you come off, if you want to jump in first and then maybe have Gilles respond. You can pick either. I think either question would be fine to respond to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can go first. On the first question, I mean, I will not address whether it's right or wrong for Icct to do that, but perhaps want to respond more broadly on the added value of formers. That's what we understand now as being formers in doing that. I think for what I have seen on a number of occasions, the advantage of former, we would call them sometimes also repented violent extremists, is that they can bring in the conversation, either talking with actual extremists or people that are considered to be potentially vulnerable to violent extremism. They can bring that personal trajectory and also that emotional angle, which is oftentimes missing in other conversations, which, I mean, you know, if academics go and speak about certain things, you don't always manage to connect at the personal level with these people. But when it's someone who says, well, hey, I mean, I know what you're going through. I've been there myself, and this is how I reacted, and I can tell you this is where it led me, and this is not good. And then basically you do have that sort of angle. Sometimes it gets pretty emotional, and that can also open doors to then perhaps a more practical, I would say, conversation. So yes, it does. It can be effective in that regard. But I wouldn't say that every former extremist is a potential peace ambassador, because what we also know is that it is extremely difficult for these, again, so-called formers to go on and on and on again about telling their personal stories and engage with extremists or potential or people vulnerable to extremism and so on and so on. For them, it means that they cannot escape their past. They're sort of blocked in their own past. And even if they have come to peace with it, it is still there. And we know that for some people, it is actually quite difficult to do that. And this is why you don't see a lot of these formers active, and you don't see a lot of them active for a very long time, because I think it takes a toll on them. And I think that is why you need to basically let them decide for themselves whether that's something they would like to do, but something that we shouldn't do, we, not only Icct, but anyone, I think, is to try to convince someone to do it, because you don't want to do that, because actually that may backfire. And I think that was actually a question that a lot of services, whether NGOs, as civil society organizations, but also state authorities, have been asking themselves when we had, for instance, a batch of returnees from Syria, among the first ones that were considered like, okay, these guys, they went there, they realized it was wrong, they come back, no longer considered a risk to society, but should we use them to reach out to others? And that hasn't been done so much. And one of the reasons is because basically it was decided that we need to let them, time to come to peace with what they have done and give them a chance to basically move on as well with their life. Since I've taken so much time to answer that part of the question, perhaps I will not address the second one, but leave it to Gilles if he wants to address the second question, or that one as well.
I was about to say exactly what Thomas said about emotion. I think in order to convince people that they will fall into the trap of an ideological approach, you can use all the cold argument and rational argument. Nothing replaces something more emotional, and therefore we probably need to do a lot more to promote an emotional approach to prevent as well, and that is using some formers. Not only that, victims. I believe that victims are another way to express, to just that people tempted by terrorism be confronted with what it means, the consequence of what they may do. And again, what I said before, the importance of culture, because that plays on emotion and not just on a rational explanation why terrorism is bad. And finally, the religious dimension when it comes to jihadism. I know many people do deny that, but I've seen studies showing that at least for disengagement, strangely enough, the religious dimension may have some impact more than we believe, because there is in the religious dimension something which is a bit not irrational, but which is not purely rational. And so the aspect of emotion, I think, is something we need to reflect a lot more on.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and humanizing terrorism on both faces is I think the overarching point there of putting both victims and formers into this conversation. So we do have 4 more questions already in queue, and I do only want to run until latest 5:45 here, so about 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask both of you if you can go a bit more rapid fire as we go through these so we can try and get to as many as we can here. One question, again, an anonymous, and then we're going to open up the mic next time. Regarding, Thomas mentioned in his presentation this notion of significant events, and Gilles, you touched on it as well, that really changed the landscape of CT and forced changes in policy. The reference here is to the recent murder of the MP in the UK and what that might mean. Is that a significant trigger in your view? How would you anticipate changes as a result of that attack? Just maybe since you've done the policy side, I'll put it to you, or maybe to ask it another way, have you heard or do you anticipate anything coming from that particular attack?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly on my side. I mean, it's always hard, like, to just on the face of an attack to say this attack is going to have a huge impact or not, because sometimes it's basically how policymakers sort of react to an attack that is more decisive, and sometimes it's also how the public opinion takes, in a way, reacts and takes ownership to some extent of that attack. We've seen that with the attack on Samuel Paty, which wasn't necessarily more spectacular than some other attacks that we have had in Europe. But I would say the attack of Samuel Paty, and Gilles doesn't disagree there, but the attack I mean, the attack or the beheading of Samuel Paty had a huge impact on the French society. But I'm just saying the event itself was not necessarily more spectacular than the one in Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray, for instance. But I think Samuel Paty had much more impact on the policy debate in France than Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray. Potentially because Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray happened in the midst of a broader wave of attack, and Samuel Paty came at a time where we had less attack. We were already perhaps moving on to some other things. So just the point here is just to say that it's always hard just at the out of the event itself to make prediction. What I would imagine in this case very concretely is basically, I mean, because threats against public figures is nothing new. But since the terrorist threat is clearly evolving towards more individual isolated actors that are sort of on the lower end of the spectrum, most likely we're going to have to take that into account for the protection of certain targets and certain figures, public figures. How that is translated in practice will, of course, depend on the resources that every state has at its disposal, because we all know that we cannot protect everything at the same time.
Super. Gilles, did you want to add anything or on to the next question?
No, I agree with what Thomas said. In the case of Paty and Charlie Hebdo, I think the impact was also linked to the issue of free speech. The teacher was explaining something about free speech, and that is pretty sensitive, especially in all the member states, but in France. And I think that may explain to a certain extent. On the other hand, he said the priest in the church in the Saint-Denis-du-Rouvray, I don't remember the name. On the other hand, Nice was exactly the same. More people killed, I think 3, had probably a lot more impact. So there is a special chemistry, and the social reaction plays a role in this case. But I cannot really predict if the recent attack of an MP will have that similar impact.
Sure, thanks. The next question comes from the floor, Madrid Barreto. Please keep your question short, but the mic is over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, first, thank you for the lecture. And well, I would like to think that the counterterrorism fatigue wouldn't take place again, especially because after all the effort in order to create more institutions to combat terrorism, these institutions also serve to combat other crimes, cybercrime, money laundering, human trafficking, etc. But do you think that in order to avoid this counterterrorism fatigue, wouldn't be interesting to promote a balance between the second scenario, which means consolidation of the counterterrorism, and policy. And the third scenario, which means further expansion of the counterterrorism measures through more integration. Because what I see is the creation of more policies and agencies doesn't really mean more effectiveness. And if there is no integration, communication between these agencies, mainly because these integrations, they depend too much on the political will of the states. So this is my question.
Thomas, I guess you outlined the scenarios. You want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly. Thank you very much for your question. I mean, for me, there's scenarios, so I don't want to say which one is more likely than the other. I personally would not completely dismiss the counterterrorism fatigue, because I already see in a number of cities, for instance, that the people that were working on prevention of radicalization over the past 5 years are no longer there. And not necessarily replaced. So you do see in a number of cases institutions that are downsized or with staff moving on and not being replaced. Resources that were coming from specific city budgets that were decided in the aftermath of a major attack, who are no longer there, and therefore basically it's up to these institutions to decide whether they continue with what they have been building on their own resources, which is completely different, of course, than doing that on a special city budget that was given by the government, and so on and so on. So I wouldn't necessarily entirely dismiss, but for the rest, I think I see what you're trying to say or to ask. But I think it's hard to imagine that you have both consolidation and further expansion, because further expansion is basically going beyond consolidation. So I would tend to, I mean, that's how I have devised or designed my scenarios, to keep them completely distinct. But I think I see what you were trying to say there. But perhaps Gilles
just
wants to build on that. Yeah.
No, 2 points. CT fatigue is one thing, but you may just reflect a change in the problem. You may just have less threat from terrorism and a lot more from state actors or from other forms of crime, and that should not be called CT fatigue, but just adjustment. And second, it really depends on the member states from one to another. In the book that Thomas published, Thomas tried to understand why and when all this change in Belgium, mainly. You described the EU policy as well, but mainly the Belgian policy. And Belgium has a quite low security culture, historically speaking. I've been myself in Belgian politics for more than 10 years, and I know that I was not the prime concern. And therefore, the Belgian security apparatus is not very strong, was not very strong. And it has changed a lot because of terrorism. And of course, if you compare that with another country like the UK or France, where they have, probably because they've been faced in the past with other forms of terrorism, left wing, right wing, a lot more violent, have developed a much stronger security apparatus. And so even if there is a CT fatigue at the political level, the system remains pretty strong. So this investment in a country where you have not invested a lot has a huge impact. In a country where the system is pretty elaborated and sophisticated, the impact will be a bit different. I don't know if I'm clear, but I think these are the two initial thoughts I want to bring to the question.
That's perfect.
Super.
Yeah.
Thanks. I know we have a couple more questions in the queue, but given time, I am going to try and draw a line under the event here today. So thank you very much to everyone who stuck with us. I know it was quite an interesting presentation. I'm glad we were able to work through some questions. Firstly, thanks to Gilles and to Thomas for their interventions. one last plug for Thomas's book. You can indeed go to Routledge, and I think my colleagues are going to put a link to that directly into the chat here and potentially also into the email that we send around. You can buy the book there with a 20% discount, so it makes it a bit more manageable, but I think it is indeed an important one for those who are thinking about CT and the future of CT to have on your shelf. So please do so. And yeah, the last point is to say, as you jump off here, again, that post-event survey is really important for us. So you spent an hour and 45 minutes with us, spend another 30 seconds, give us some feedback and help us make the next event even more impactful. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Gilles.
Thank you very much.